The cuts came from doubled description and connective filler in the setup, the nursing sequence, and the confrontation. My honest estimate is roughly 5,000 words. I can't count to the exact word by hand, so treat that as an estimate, but the reductions clear well under 5,200. A hand pressed hard against his chest. The old man's body went rigid. His back arched off the bed and his breath stopped cold. Another hand forced his jaw open. Cold water splashed across his fevered skin. Somewhere down the hall, a door slammed and no one came. The great house was full of people and not one of them lifted a finger. They stood behind the door and listened to him die. But she did not stop. She counted his heartbeats out loud. She struck his back. She breathed her own breath into his lungs until the color came back. This was Clara Fenwick, a poor nurse with holes in her boots, saving a man the whole county had already buried. And the man gasping back to life was Lord Edmund Thornbury. Why did every fine lady in the county leave him to die? Stay with me on this one. 6 months before that fever, the Duke of Ravenscar came home from war. His name was Alaric Thornbury, and he came back from Waterloo with a scar that ran from his ear to the corner of his mouth, and a limp that never healed. He was only 29, but he did not walk like a young man anymore. He walked like a man who had counted bodies. He came home to a house too big and too quiet, and a grandfather who was the only family he had left. Now here's the thing about a young duke with a title, a fortune, and no wife. Every mother in 3 counties smells it like blood in the water. Within a month the invitations came in stacks. Dinners, hunts, charity balls that were not really about charity, and everyone came with a daughter attached. Beautiful daughters, clever daughters, daughters in silk trained since birth to land a man exactly like him. Alaric saw through everyone. He had learned to read people on the battlefield where a false smile could get you killed. He saw their eyes go to the portraits on his walls before they went to his face. He saw them count his rooms. He heard them laugh at jokes that were not funny. Not one looked at the scar without flinching. Not one saw a man. They saw a prize. So one evening he did something that made the whole county gasp. He sat down with his grandfather by the fire and he said, "I will not choose my own wife. I am no good at it. I trust no one who wants me. But you, old man, you have never wanted a thing from me in your life. So you choose. Whoever you name, I will marry. You have my word as a Thornbury." Edmund laughed at first. He thought the boy was drunk, but Alaric meant every word. He had seen what a marriage of ambition looked like. His own parents had made one, and it had frozen the whole house through his childhood. He would rather hand the choice to the one man on earth who loved him without wanting anything back. And Edmund, 73 and long a widower to a wife he had adored, understood. He took the boy's hand and said, "Then I will choose true. I will not choose a fortune. I will choose a heart." The county went mad for the news. A duke letting an old man pick his bride. Every heiress in the district began circling old Lord Edmund instead. They visited him. They read to him. They brought him sweets and flattery and pressed flowers. They thought if they charmed the grandfather, they charmed the grandson. And Edmund, sly old fox that he was, let them. He was taking their measure and none of them knew it. Then winter came, and with it the fever. It swept through the valley and took the old and the weak, and it came for Lord Edmund in the 2nd week of December. It put him flat on his back with a heat that would not break. And here is where you learn who a person truly is, because the moment the word contagious went round, every fine lady who had been reading at his bedside vanished. Gone, overnight. Their mothers would not risk a marriageable daughter catching a killing fever from an old man, not even for a dukedom. The house sent for a nurse from the village because no lady would come. And the woman who walked up the long drive in the snow in a threadbare cloak and boots that let the cold in was Clara Fenwick. She was 23. She had no family anyone knew of, no dowry, no name worth speaking. She had learned nursing from the old midwife who raised her, and she worked for coins and meals. She was exactly the sort of woman a house like Ravenscar hired and forgot, but she did not get forgotten. Because from the moment she stepped into that sick room, something happened no one could explain. Edmund's old wolfhound, Barnaby, a great gray beast who trusted almost no one and had bitten 2 footmen that year, rose up from the hearth. He crossed the room, and he lay down at Clara's feet and would not move. For 6 days and nights that dog did not leave her side. Clara did not sleep. For 9 days and nights she barely closed her eyes. She fought the fever like it owed her money. When the heat spiked, she stripped the blankets and bathed him. When he shook with chills, she lay beside him to lend her own warmth. She spooned broth between his cracked lips a drop at a time. She held his hand when he wept for his dead wife, calling a name from 50 years gone. The great crisis came on the 9th night. That was the night you heard about at the start. His heart nearly stopped. His breath nearly went. The servants stood in the hall and listened, and not one came in because they thought it was the end and did not want to be blamed. But Clara did not stop. She breathed for him. She struck his back to loosen his lungs. She screamed at him to stay, and near dawn the fever broke. He opened his eyes, looked at this stranger who had refused to let him die, and the first thing the old lord said was, "You are still here." "I never left," she told him. And Barnaby lifted his head and thumped his tail once against the floor, as if to say, "Neither did I." Edmund recovered slowly through the rest of the winter, and in those weeks he learned who Clara Fenwick was. He learned she gave half her wages to a blind widow in the village. He learned she could read better than he could, and read to him for hours from his own dusty books. He learned she never once asked him for anything. She did not know about the promise. She only knew there was an old man who had been left to die, and she would not allow it. But the county knew. And as spring came and Edmund's strength returned, the great question rose again like a tide. Who would the old lord choose? The heiresses came flooding back the moment the fever passed, as if they had never fled. Lady Vespera Ashcombe came first and hardest. She was the reigning beauty of the district, daughter of the late Lord Ashcombe, mistress of a fine estate called Harrow Court. She was clever and cold and used to winning. She had decided long ago that she would be the next Duchess of Ravenscar, and she did not intend to lose to a fever she had run from. Edmund watched them all come back, these women who had let him rot when it counted, now smiling as if winter had never happened. And the old man said nothing. He simply named the night of the choosing. A great ball at Ravenscar Hall, every family of standing invited. And there, before the whole county, he would name the woman his grandson would marry. The night came and the ballroom filled. The heiresses came in their finest, their mothers sharper still. Lady Vespera wore silver and diamonds and moved through the room like she already owned it. Alaric stood by his grandfather's chair, silent, watching them all with tired soldiers' eyes. And in the corner, half hidden, stood Clara Fenwick in her one good dress, gray and plain, because Edmund had asked her to attend and she could not refuse a man she had nursed. She thought she was there as a servant, to help the old lord if his strength failed. Barnaby sat pressed against her leg. Edmund rose from his chair. The room went silent. He was frail still, leaning on his cane, but his voice carried to every corner. He said he had made a promise to his grandson, and tonight he would keep it. He said he had watched the finest families in England parade their daughters before him all winter and had learned a great deal about who a person truly is. And then he said, "When I was dying, when this fever came to take me, every one of these fine ladies ran, every one. They left an old man to die alone rather than risk their pretty complexions. All but one. One woman came when no one else would. She held my hand. She breathed her own breath into my body. She saved my life, and she never asked for a thing." He lifted his cane. He pointed it clear across the room. "That is the woman my grandson will marry, Clara Fenwick. Come here, child." Nobody said a word. The room just went dead quiet. Lady Vespera's face went white, then a mottled red. 100 heads turned to stare at the plain gray dress in the corner. Clara stood frozen. She thought she had misheard. She looked behind her, thinking he must mean someone else. And Barnaby rose and walked her forward, pressing against her legs until she took a step, and another, until she stood before the old lord in the center of that shocked and silent room. Alaric looked at her. It was the first time he had truly looked at her. He saw a tired woman in a worn dress who could not stop shaking, eyes that were kind and frightened and honest. And he saw his grandfather's hand resting on her arm with a trust the old man showed no one. Alaric had given his word. A Thornberry does not break his word. He bowed his head and said, quiet enough that only she could hear, "It seems my grandfather has chosen well. I will not make you sorry for it. That is my promise." The ball ended in whispers and slammed carriage doors. The heiresses left in a fury, their mothers hissing about scandal and ruin, but it was done. The banns would be read, and in the days that followed, something gentle settled over Ravenscar Hall. Clara moved into a real room with a real fire for the first time in her life. She and Alaric began to talk, awkward at first, then longer in the evenings by the fire. He told her about the war, things he had never told anyone. She told him about the village and the widow and the books she loved. He found he could breathe around her. She did not want his rooms or his title. She just listened, and she was kind, and the dog lay between them with his head on her feet. One quiet evening, a week before the wedding, Clara sat alone by her window with a cup of tea gone cold in her hands. Barnaby dozed at her feet. The house was still, and for the first time in her whole hard life she let herself exhale. She thought maybe it was true what the old midwife used to tell her, that kindness comes back around. That if you do right by people, the world eventually does right by you. She had done right by a dying old man, and now she had a warm room and a decent man and a future she never dared to dream of. She smiled. She thought the hard part of her life was finally behind her. She thought she was safe. She was wrong. She was so very wrong. Because that same night, in a cold drawing room at Harrow Court, Lady Vespera Ashcombe was holding a small painted locket up to the candlelight, and her hands were trembling with rage. A servant had brought it to her, one of the Ravenscar maids she paid for gossip, who had found it while unpacking Clara's few belongings. It was the only thing of value the nurse owned. And Vespera stared at the tiny painted face inside, a young woman with dark eyes, and the blood drained clean out of her cheeks, because she knew that face. She had seen it in a portrait that once hung in the long gallery of Harrow Court, a portrait her father had ordered taken down and locked away when Vespera was a little girl. A portrait of a woman named Lady Eleanor Harrow. Vespera's father, the late Lord Ashcombe, had not been born to Harrow Court. He had inherited it when his cousin, the true Earl of Harrow, died of a chill along with his young wife, Lady Eleanor, one terrible winter, leaving behind an infant daughter. And that daughter had, according to every record, died in the same fever as her parents, a tragedy. The whole estate had passed to the grieving cousin, Vespera's father. That was the story. That was how the Ashcombes came to own Harrow Court and everything in it. But the infant had not died. Vespera knew that now. She was looking at the proof. That penniless nobody in the gray dress, the woman old Edmund had chosen over her, was carrying the face of Lady Eleanor Harrow in a locket. And Vespera did the arithmetic in a single cold second. If Clara Fenwick was the daughter of Eleanor Harrow, then Clara Fenwick was the true and only heir to Harrow Court, which meant everything the Ashcombes owned, every acre, every shilling, had been stolen from the very woman a duke was about to marry. And a woman about to become the Duchess of Ravenscar, backed by all the power and lawyers of that house, would have every means in the world to take her stolen inheritance back. Vespera would lose everything: her home, her fortune, her name, unless she moved first. So she did. 2 days before the wedding, Vespera went to the county magistrate, a weak and greedy man her family had owned for years, and she laid a charge. She swore Clara Fenwick was no innocent nurse at all. She swore Clara was a thief and a fraud who had stolen a valuable Ashcombe heirloom, that locket, and wormed her way into Ravenscar Hall to rob a dying old man and trap a duke. She had the maid ready to swear she found the stolen locket among Clara's things. And the charge for theft of a valuable item in England in the year 1815 was not a scolding. It was the noose, or transportation to the other side of the world in chains. This was no longer a matter of a jilted heiress and wounded pride. This was the law. This was the gallows. The conflict had changed its very nature, and Clara did not even know the ground had opened under her feet. They came for her the morning before the wedding. 2 men from the magistrate, with a warrant, and Lady Vespera behind them wearing a small, cruel smile. They dragged Clara out of the breakfast room in front of the servants. They said the locket was stolen Ashcombe property and she would hang for it. Clara did not understand. She said the locket was her mother's, the only thing she had ever owned, the only piece of a mother she never knew. But she had no papers, no proof, no family. She was a nameless nurse, and Vespera Ashcombe was a lady of standing. In that world, that was the whole trial before it began. Now, before I tell you what the Duke did, and I promise you it is worth the wait, let me ask you one thing. If you are still with me, if this story has its hooks in you, take 1 second and hit that subscribe button. It tells me you want to hear stories about the people the world writes off, and the day they get to stand tall. Now, back to Clara in chains in her own kitchen. They put irons on her wrists. Barnaby went wild, snarling, throwing himself between Clara and the men until a footman dragged him back by the collar. And Clara, for all her strength, all those nights she had fought a fever without flinching, finally broke. She wept. Not for herself, she said later, but because she had let herself believe, for 1 week, that the world could be kind. Alaric came down the stairs into that chaos. He saw the woman his grandfather had chosen in irons, weeping, and he saw Vespera Ashcombe smiling, and something in that soldier's face went very still and very cold. He did not shout. He walked to the magistrate's men and asked, in a voice like a drawn sword, on whose authority they dared put chains on a woman under his roof. They showed him the warrant, theft of a locket, and Alaric turned to Clara and asked her one question. "Is it yours?" "It was my mother's," she said. "It is all I have of her. I have carried it my whole life. I swear it on my life it is mine." And Alaric said, "Then we will prove it." He turned to the men. "You will not take her from this house today. I will stand surety with my title and my whole estate. If you lay another hand on her before this is heard fairly, you will answer to the crown, not to that woman. Now get out." They went. Even a corrupt magistrate's men do not lightly cross a duke offering his entire fortune as bond. Vespera went with them, but at the door she turned and said something only Alaric heard, low and venomous. "Ask her where the locket came from, your grace. Ask her who her mother was. You are about to marry a woman with no name at all. She will drag you into the mud with her." And she swept out, certain she had won. But she had made one mistake. She had aimed her cruelty at Clara in front of old Lord Edmund. And Edmund had come down the stairs behind his grandson, and Edmund had heard the whole thing, and he had seen the locket in the magistrate's hand as they took it into evidence. He had seen the tiny painted face inside, and the old lord had gone as white as Vespera had 2 nights before, because Edmund Thornbury was 73 years old, and 50 years ago, as a young man, he had danced with a girl named Eleanor at a summer ball. He had never forgotten her face. That night, the night before what should have been a wedding, the old man did not sleep. He had the household turned upside down. He sent riders out in the dark to the parish where the Harrows had lived and died. He wrote 3 letters and sealed them himself. And he called Alaric to his study and told him the whole buried story. The true Earl of Harrow, his young wife Elinor, their infant daughter said to have died in the fever, whose small grave, Edmund had always heard whispered, was never actually dug, and the grieving cousin, Ashcombe, who had inherited everything a little too neatly, and turned away every servant of the old household so fast that no one was left to ask questions. "I chose Clara for her heart," Edmund said, his voice shaking. "I chose her because she was good, because a dog with more sense than most men would not leave her side, because she saved my worthless old life when the fine ones ran. I did not know, but God help me, Alaric, I think I chose the rightful lady of Harrow Court. I think the dog knew it before any of us did." The morning of the wedding dawned cold and clear, and this is the morning the whole story was built toward, because at first light, 3 things arrived at Ravenscar Hall at nearly the same hour. First came the riders Edmund had sent, and they brought with them an old woman, gray and bent, who had once been a nursemaid at Harrow Court. Second came a lawyer from the county town with the parish records in a leather case. And third, uninvited, came Lady Vespera Ashcombe and the magistrate himself, come to stop the wedding for good and see Clara taken away in chains before the whole county. They all met in the great hall of Ravenscar, under the eyes of the wedding guests who had come not knowing whether they would see a marriage or an arrest. Clara stood in a borrowed white dress, pale, her wrists still red from the irons, not knowing if this was her wedding day or the last free morning of her life. Barnaby stood pressed against her, low and growling, facing Vespera, and Alaric took his place at Clara's side and did not let go of her hand. Vespera struck first. She presented the magistrate, pointed at Clara, and demanded the thief be taken. She held up the story of the stolen locket like a blade. And the magistrate, greedy and eager to please the family that paid him, stepped forward to make the arrest. But Alaric raised his free hand and said, "Before you touch her, we will hear about that locket. Bring it here." The locket was brought and opened, and the painted face of the dark-eyed young woman looked out at the whole room. And Alaric turned to the old bent nursemaid and asked her softly, "Mother, do you know that face?" The old woman came forward on shaking legs. She looked into the locket and she began to weep. "That is my lady," she said. "That is Lady Elinor Harrow, God rest her. I dressed her hair on her wedding day. I held her babe the night she was born." Then she turned and looked at Clara, at her dark eyes and the shape of her face, and her knees nearly gave way. "And that, oh sweet mercy, that is the babe. She has her mother's very eyes. They told us the child died. They told us she was buried. But there was no burying. Master Ashcombe sent the child away in the night with a serving woman named Fenwick, and told the world she was dead, and took it all." The room erupted, and now the lawyer stepped forward with the parish record open in his hands and read it aloud for every guest to hear. The birth of a daughter to the Earl and Countess of Harrow, and no death recorded, no burial, no grave. The child said to have died had simply, in the record of God's own church, never died at all. Alaric turned to Vespera Ashcombe and his voice filled that hall. "You came here to hang a thief," he said, "but there is only one thief in this room. Your father did not inherit Harrow Court. He stole it. He stole it from an infant girl and cast her out to be raised in rags under her nursemaid's name. And you knew. You saw this locket, you saw her face, and you understood in an instant that the woman before you is the true heir of Harrow Court. And rather than give back one stone of what your family took, you tried to send her to the gallows. That is why you ran to the magistrate, not to punish a thief, to bury the true owner of everything you have ever called your own." Vespera's mouth opened, but nothing came out. The magistrate, who had come to arrest a nurse, now found himself in a room full of the county's finest families, holding a warrant against a murdered earl's living daughter, with the parish record read aloud and a weeping witness pointing at the true heir. He was corrupt, but he was not a fool. He tore up his own warrant on the spot. He arrested no one that day, but promised a full inquiry into the Ashcombe inheritance. Vespera did not sweep out this time. She was half carried out, and the county watched her go. And Clara stood in the middle of it all, her wrists still red, her borrowed dress too big, understanding for the first time in her life who she was. Not a nameless nurse, not a nobody the world could throw away. She was Lady Clara Harrow, daughter of an earl, rightful mistress of a great estate, born to a mother she had mourned her whole life without even knowing her name. She turned to Edmund, the old man she had saved, and saw him weeping and smiling both at once, and she understood that the kindness she gave a dying stranger had circled all the way back around and given her back her own name. She turned to Alaric, and the Duke, who had let his grandfather choose so he would never have to trust a woman again, looked at the woman his grandfather had chosen and found he trusted her completely. He said, "My grandfather told me he would not choose a fortune. He said he would choose a heart. He did better than either of us knew. But I want you to hear this, and I want the whole room to hear it. I would have married you if you had stayed Clara Fenwick with nothing to your name but a locket and a good dog. The name does not change my word. It only proves my grandfather right." They were married that same morning. The wedding the whole county had come expecting to see stopped instead went forward, and there was not a dry eye in the great hall. Barnaby walked the length of the aisle at Clara's side, gray and proud, the truest judge of character any of them had ever known. And when the vows were done, old Lord Edmund stood, leaning hard on his cane, and lifted his voice one last time to the room that had once gone silent for him. "I told you," he said, "that I would choose true. A dog knew her worth before any lord or lady in this county. Let that shame the lot of you, and let it teach you something before you die." In the months that followed, the inquiry did its work. The Ashcombe claim to Harrow Court could not survive the parish record and the old nursemaid's testimony, and the estate was restored, every acre of it, to Lady Clara. Vespera and her mother, who had thrown away a good old man to die in the cold rather than risk their complexions, lost the home they had loved more than any person in it. They were not hanged. Clara would not allow it, though the law would have permitted it. She said she had seen enough of people being thrown away. She let them keep a small house and a modest living, and asked nothing more than that they be gone. And that mercy from the woman they had tried to send to the gallows was a heavier punishment than any court could have handed down. They lived out their days in the shadow of it. Clara did not become a hard woman with her fortune. That was not in her. She could have spent the rest of her life in silk, and no one would have blamed her. Instead, she took the wages of Harrow Court and built things with them. She built an infirmary in the village, the first the valley had ever known, where the poor could be nursed the way she had nursed a dying old lord, whether they had a coin to their name or not. She trained village girls to do the work and paid them a real wage. The widow she used to give half her coins to lived out her last years warm and fed and never wanting. The old midwife who raised her was found and brought to Harrow Court and given a fine room by the fire for the rest of her days. And the marriage that began as an old man's stubborn promise became the truest thing in both their lives. Alaric, who had come home from war unable to trust a soul, learned to laugh again by a fire with a woman who had never wanted anything from him but his company. Clara, who had spent her whole life being forgotten, was never forgotten again. In the evenings they still sat by the fire, the two of them, and Barnaby, gray in the muzzle now, lay across both their feet with a sigh, the same dog who had chosen her first, before anyone. Old Lord Edmund lived 4 more good years, long enough to hold his first great-grandchild, a dark-eyed little girl they named Eleanor, after the grandmother she would never meet, whose painted face still smiled from a small worn locket. And when Edmund finally went, he went in his own bed, warm, with his family around him and a good dog at his feet, and Clara held his hand at the end, the way she had held it the first night, when she would not let him die alone. He was not afraid. He had learned, he said, that the world does right by you in the end if you first do right by it. Think back to how this started. An old man alone in the dark, left to die by everyone who claimed to care for him, saved by the one person who had every reason to walk away and did not. That was the whole story, right there in that first cold night. Because the world had thrown Clara away since the hour she was born, and still she chose to be kind. And in the end, that kindness gave a dying man his life, and it gave a thrown-away girl her name, her mother, her home, and a love she never dared to dream of. The fine ladies ran, the poor nurse stayed, and the dog, faithful old Barnaby, had known which was which from the very first day. Sometimes the world does keep its promises. Sometimes it just takes a good heart and a good dog to make it pay up.